The police cruiser rolled slowly down the dirt road, red clay dust rising behind it like smoke. Officer Dale Pruitt had been working Mercer County for 11 years. He'd driven this stretch of farmland 100 times, past the old oak lines, past the weathered fence posts, past fields that turned gold in October and brown by November. He knew this land the way he knew his own kitchen. So when the call came in, trespassing complaint, black male, southeastern quadrant near Holloway Estate, he didn't rush. He'd handled complaints from the new estates before. Rich folks moving in from Atlanta, buying up the view, then acting like they'd bought the horizon too. He pulled up slowly. And there he was. An older black man standing in a field, completely still, hands at his sides, watching the cruiser approach with the calm patience of someone who had been watching people arrive on this land his entire life. He wore muddy boots and a flannel shirt faded from too many washes. A battered Ford pickup sat parked behind him, the bed loaded with soil samples in small paper bags, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Pruitt stepped out of the car. Behind him, another cruiser pulled in. Then another. Because Margaret Holloway hadn't just called once. She'd called 3 times in 40 minutes, each call more urgent than the last, each one escalating the description of the man she'd seen, suspicious, then aggressive, then refusing to leave. She stood now at the edge of her manicured lawn in tall designer boots, arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the clouds. "That's him," she said loudly, as if she were identifying livestock. "He's been out there for 2 hours. This is private property. I want him removed." Officer Pruitt looked at the man in the field. The man looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Pruitt did something Margaret Holloway did not expect. He took off his hat. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The field went silent except for the wind moving through the grass. Margaret's mouth opened slowly. Because something had just happened that she didn't understand yet, but she was about to. James Caldwell had been waking up before sunrise since he was 5 years old. Not because anyone forced him to. Not because life had been unkind, though it had, in ways that would break most people. He woke early because his grandfather had woken early, and his father after him, and somewhere in that rhythm, James had found something that felt like prayer. The land in Mercer County, Georgia was red and hard and unforgiving. It cracked in summer and flooded in spring and offered nothing freely. You had to work it. You had to know it, which fields drained, which ones held water, which stretches of clay ran too deep for root crops but were perfect for sorghum and hay. James Caldwell knew every acre. He'd grown up on a small parcel his grandfather, Elias Caldwell, had purchased in 1951, 40 acres on the eastern side of the county that most white landowners at the time had considered worthless. Too rocky in the north, too low in the south. Elias had paid cash, quietly, through an intermediary, because that was the only way a black man could safely buy land in Georgia in 1951. Elias had known what they didn't. He'd worked that soil by hand for 2 years before anyone noticed what was growing. By the time James's father, Robert Caldwell, took over in the 1970s, the family had added 2 more parcels, 60 acres to the west purchased from a bankrupt cotton farm and 20 acres along the creek bed that no one else wanted because of the flooding. Robert had engineered the drainage himself. By the time James inherited the land at 34, after burying his father on a Tuesday in February, the Caldwell family owned just over 300 acres. What James had done with the next 33 years was something that almost nobody in Mercer County fully understood. He hadn't advertised it. He hadn't announced it. He'd simply kept doing what his grandfather taught him, watching the land, learning which parcels came up for sale, buying quietly through legal entities that carried names like Redfield Agricultural LLC and Caldwell Land Holdings Trust, names that appeared in county records without fanfare, without photographs, without anyone connecting them to the quiet black man in the battered pickup truck. He'd bought parcels that flooded. Parcels with bad access roads. Parcels with title disputes that he'd patiently resolved over years. Parcels so overgrown that no one else wanted to bother. One by one, they'd become his. By the morning Margaret Holloway called the police, James Caldwell owned 4,260 acres in Mercer County, Georgia. That was nearly half of all the privately held agricultural land in the county. He'd never told a soul outside his family. He'd never needed to. Margaret Holloway had made her money in Atlanta real estate, specifically, in the kind of neighborhoods where prices doubled by doing nothing except waiting and holding. She was 61, twice divorced, and had recently decided that what she deserved after a career of aggressive acquisitions was a quiet life in the Georgia countryside. She'd purchased the Whitmore estate in March, a 12-bedroom property on 300 acres of what the realtor had described as pristine undeveloped land with gorgeous pastoral views. The price had been $4 million. Margaret had paid it in full. She'd hired a landscaping company from Savannah, a home renovation team from Buckhead, and a property management company from Augusta. She'd replanted the front drive with ornamental grasses, installed a heated pool, and commissioned a custom iron gate with her initials worked into the ironwork. She had not, at any point, researched the property lines in detail. She had not walked the full perimeter. She had not spoken to a single neighbor. She had assumed, the way people who have always been assumed about sometimes assume about others, that the surrounding land was either public or unoccupied. She was wrong on both counts. The field where James Caldwell was taking soil samples on that Tuesday morning was not near her property line. It was not adjacent to her property line. It was not her property at all. It was his. It had been his since 2009, when he'd purchased it from the estate of a deceased farmer named Harold Gentry for $70,000 in cash. But Margaret Holloway didn't know that. And so she'd done what people in her position often do when they see something they don't understand, something that doesn't fit the picture they've constructed of their world. She'd called the police. 3 times, the 2 additional officers who arrived that morning were younger than Pruitt. Both were relatively new to Mercer County. Neither of them knew James Caldwell on site the way Pruitt did. One of them, Officer Kevin Marsh, 26, 18 months on the job, had taken the 3rd call from Margaret and arrived already tense, already rehearsing a script about lawful orders and trespassing statutes. He stepped out of his cruiser with his hand on his belt. "Sir," he said loudly, approaching James across the field. "I need you to identify yourself and explain what you're doing on this property." James turned to look at him slowly. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't step back. He simply looked at the young officer the way a man looks at someone who doesn't yet know what he doesn't know. "I'm James Caldwell," he said. His voice was low and steady. "And I'm collecting soil samples. Do you have permission to be on this land?" "I own this land." Marsh blinked. "Sir. The parcel designation is M447 in the county records," James said calmly. "Purchased June 14, 2009. Held under Redfield Agricultural LLC. I'm the sole member of that LLC." He reached slowly into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "I carry a copy of the deed. I've been carrying a copy of the deed for 15 years, for exactly this kind of situation." Marsh took the paper. He read it. He read it again. From across the field, Margaret's voice cut through the morning air. "Whatever he's showing you, he printed it this morning. That's not his land. This is all part of my estate." Pruitt walked over to Marsh and looked at the paper. Then he took out his radio and called it in to the county recorder's office. The silence that followed lasted about 4 minutes. Then the response came back over the radio. And even Pruitt, who had suspected what was coming, felt the hair on his arms stand up. Because the county recorder's office confirmed not just the parcel James had named. They confirmed 4 other parcels surrounding the Holloway estate as well. And then they said something that made Marsh go very still. They said that the original property survey used in the Holloway sale had contained an error, a boundary line that had been incorrectly marked in 2021, and that based on current recorded deeds, approximately 37 acres of what Margaret Holloway believed was her property actually belonged to Redfield Agricultural LLC. To James Caldwell. The woman in the designer boots had been living, for the past 4 months, on land that wasn't entirely hers. The morning did not go the way Margaret Holloway had expected. She'd expected the officers to escort the old black farmer off the property with a warning. She'd expected a quiet resolution. She'd expected, if she was honest, the particular efficiency that comes when the world organizes itself the way she was used to. Instead, Officer Pruitt walked back across the field toward her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said. "We've confirmed Mr. Caldwell's ownership of this parcel. He has every legal right to be here." Margaret stared at him. "That's absurd." "The county recorder confirms it." "Then the county recorder is wrong." Her voice was sharp, clipped, the voice of a woman who had made lesser men back down 100 times. "I paid $4 million for this property. I have a deed. I have a title policy." "Yes, ma'am. You may want to contact your title insurance company and your attorney, because there appears to be a survey discrepancy in your original purchase documents." The word discrepancy landed strangely. Margaret pulled off her sunglasses. "What kind of discrepancy?" Pruitt paused. He was a careful man. He chose his next words deliberately. "The kind that means some of what you were sold may not have been the seller's to sell." The color left Margaret's face slowly, like water draining from a basin. Across the field, James Caldwell had gone back to collecting his soil samples. He moved methodically, crouching, opening a paper bag, pressing a small tool into the earth. He hadn't looked toward Margaret once since the officers had arrived. He already knew what the records said. He'd known for 4 months, since the moment the Holloway sale had appeared in the county real estate listings, and he'd recognized the parcel numbers included in the listing. He'd said nothing. He'd waited. And now he watched the Georgia Clay tell its own story, slow and patient and utterly indifferent to whoever thought they owned it. What the officers didn't know, what Margaret certainly didn't know, was that this wasn't the first time James Caldwell had been called out to his own land by someone who didn't believe it was his. The first time had been in 1998. He'd been 38 years old, newly expanded into his second set of parcels, driving his truck along a fence line he'd just finished repairing when a man named Carson Webb, who owned the adjacent cattle operation, had pulled up in a truck twice as nice as James's and told him to get off Webb family property. James had shown him the deed. Webb had told him the deed was fake. Webb had called the county, filed a complaint, hired a lawyer, and spent 18 months trying to undo a legal purchase before finally accepting, through gritted teeth and an expensive legal bill, that the land was James's and had been fairly and legally acquired. He'd never spoken to James again. There had been other incidents. A developer in 2004 who tried to acquire a parcel James owned through an LLC, not realizing the LLC belonged to the farmer he'd already dismissed. A county commissioner in 2011 who tried to reroute an agricultural support road away from Caldwell land, claiming it wasn't being productively used, until James appeared at the county meeting with 5 years of production records and a lawyer. Each time, James had done the same thing. He'd waited. He'd presented the documents. He'd spoken quietly and specifically. And he'd won. Because the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs patience. But the incident with Margaret Holloway was different. Because this wasn't just about one parcel. And this wasn't just about one misunderstanding. This was about what James had discovered when the Holloway estate sale went through, and what he'd hired an attorney to quietly investigate for the past 4 months. The results of that investigation were sitting in a manila envelope in the glove box of his truck. He hadn't opened it in front of anyone yet. He was waiting for the right moment. 3 days after the incident in the field, Margaret Holloway sat across from her attorney in his Macon office and tried to understand what she was being told. His name was Gerald Price. He was 70, careful, and very expensive. He'd been her attorney for 20 years. And he was looking at a set of county documents with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something like dread. The original survey of the Whitmore estate, he said slowly, used a boundary line that was based on a 2021 refiling. That refiling superseded the 1987 survey. But the 1987 survey is the one that was cited in the original deed. He set the papers down. The 2021 refiling was incorrect. Someone at the county level made an error. Or. He stopped. Or what, Gerald? He took off his glasses. Or it wasn't an error. Margaret stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that the survey discrepancy moves the eastern boundary line of your property approximately 300 feet westward. Which means 37 acres you've been treating as yours, including the stable, the east garden, and approximately a quarter of your rear lawn, are technically not part of your title. The room was very quiet. And those 37 acres belong to Redfield Agricultural LLC. Price folded his hands. Which is wholly owned by James Elias Caldwell of Mercer County. Margaret sat back in her chair. Outside the window, Macon moved at its usual pace, indifferent. How long has he owned those parcels? The surrounding parcels, since 2009. But the overlap. Price hesitated. Margaret, the deed trail suggests the Caldwell family may have had a claim on portions of this land going back to 1987. She stared at him. 37 years. The estate you purchased changed hands 4 times between 1987 and your acquisition. Each time, the incorrect boundary was carried forward. Each time, the error compounded. He paused. Mr. Caldwell's attorney has been in contact with my office this morning. His attorney? A firm out of Atlanta. Freeman, Okafor and Associates. They're quite good. Another pause. They've sent a formal notice of the boundary claim and have indicated their client is prepared to pursue full legal remedy. Margaret's hands were very still on the table. She thought about the iron gate with her initials. The heated pool. The ornamental grasses along the drive. She thought about the $4 million. And she thought about the old man in the field, crouching quietly in the dirt, collecting samples in paper bags while she screamed across a lawn that was, it turned out, partly his. James Caldwell sat on the porch of his farmhouse that evening as the sun went down behind the western tree line, painting the sky the color of the clay he'd spent his life working. His daughter, Renee, sat beside him. She was 41, a soil scientist at the University of Georgia, and she had her grandfather's eyes, watchful, patient, reading whatever room she was in with quiet precision. Freeman's office called, she said. They got a response from Holloway's attorney. James nodded. She wants to negotiate. Private settlement. She doesn't want it in court. James said nothing for a moment. He watched a hawk turn slow circles above the far field. What does she think I want? He finally asked. Renee almost smiled. Money, I think. That's what she understands. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. And what did you tell them? I told them we'd listen. James nodded slowly. The truth was, he didn't want Margaret Holloway's money. He had money. Not in any way that was visible to anyone who drove past his truck or saw his boots or made assumptions about what an old black farmer in Georgia could possibly have accumulated, but he had it. Carefully saved, carefully invested, quietly held. What he wanted was simpler than money. And more complicated. He wanted the boundary corrected in the county records. He wanted the original error, the 2021 refiling that had somehow migrated that line 300 feet, investigated. He wanted to know whether it had been an accident or whether someone had done it deliberately, knowing that the Whitmore estate would sell for more if those 37 acres were included. Because if it was deliberate, if someone had moved a line in a county record to add value to a property they were about to sell, that wasn't just a civil matter. That was fraud. And James Caldwell had the patience of a man who had waited 33 years to see what patience could build. He could wait a little longer. The attorney from Freeman, Okafor and Associates was named Patricia Okafor. She was 54, the daughter of a Nigerian engineer and a woman from rural Mississippi who'd picked cotton as a child. She had built her practice on exactly these kinds of cases, the ones where land and race and power intersected in the Georgia soil, where the history was long and the stakes were personal. She'd taken James's case 2 years ago, not for the Holloway situation specifically, but for a quieter ongoing legal review of the Caldwell land holdings. She'd been the one who'd flagged the boundary issue 4 months ago when the Whitmore estate sale went public. Now she sat in the Mercer County Records office with a paralegal named Devon and a certified copy of every boundary filing related to the Caldwell parcels going back to 1971. What they found took 3 days to piece together. The 2021 boundary refiling had been submitted by a surveying company called Meridian Land Services. Meridian had been hired by the then owner of the Whitmore estate, a development holding company called Peach State Heritage Properties, to conduct a survey as part of a planned sale. Meridian had produced a survey that moved the eastern boundary line 312 feet westward. That survey had been filed with the county. And 6 months later, Peach State Heritage Properties had listed the Whitmore estate for sale at $4 million, with 37 additional acres included in the listing that they had no legal right to sell. Patricia pulled the incorporation documents for Peach State Heritage Properties. She looked at the list of principals. She sat very still. Then she called James. "James," she said quietly. "You need to hear this." "I'm listening." "Peach State Heritage Properties. The company that sold Holloway the estate." A pause. "One of the managing members is a man named Carson Webb." Silence on the line. "Webb," James said finally. "The same Carson Webb who contested your land purchase in 1998. James looked out his kitchen window at the fields that had been in his family for 3 generations. "He knew," James said. "He knew exactly whose parcels that line was crossing," Patricia said. "He'd seen your deed in 1998. He knew the land was yours. And 23 years later, he redrew the line, folded it into an estate sale, and collected $4 million for land that included 37 acres he had no right to sell." The quiet that followed was the kind that comes when something you suspected but never quite said out loud finally becomes a fact. "Patricia," James said. "What does this mean legally?" "It means this isn't a civil boundary dispute anymore." Her voice was careful, controlled. "This is real estate fraud. Potentially wire fraud given the electronic filings. And it means Carson Webb needs to answer some very serious questions." The story broke on a Wednesday. Not because James had called a journalist. Not because Patricia had arranged a press conference. It broke because county records are public, and a local reporter named Alma Trent had been covering the original trespassing call as a small human interest piece. Farmer called a trespasser on his own land, and then pulled the thread. And kept pulling. By Friday, it wasn't a local story anymore. By the following Tuesday, the parking lot outside the Mercer County Courthouse had 3 satellite trucks and a crowd that included farmers from 3 counties, community leaders from Macon and Atlanta, and 2 representatives from a national civil rights organization who had driven down overnight. Margaret Holloway had not publicly commented. Carson Webb had retained criminal defense counsel. The Georgia Real Estate Commission had opened an investigation into Meridian Land Services. And James Caldwell drove his battered pickup truck to the courthouse at 8 in the morning, parked it in the same spot he'd parked it for 30 years, and walked inside wearing his cleanest flannel shirt and his second-best boots. The hearing that morning was procedural, a formal record of the boundary correction, acknowledged by the county, restoring the correct line to the county maps. It should have taken 15 minutes. But the courtroom was full. And when James took his seat at the table beside Patricia Okafor, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with a gavel. The judge, a woman named Honorable Sandra Fulton, who had grown up in Mercer County and knew the Caldwell name from decades of clean land records and prompt tax payments, looked down at the papers in front of her. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "For the record, can you confirm your full legal ownership of the parcels in question?" James stood. "Yes, Your Honor. James Elias Caldwell. My family has held land in this county since 1951. We hold it still." A sound moved through the room. Not applause. Not noise. Something quieter, the collective exhale of people who understood the weight of those words. 75 years. 3 generations. Quietly, steadily, patiently. In the back of the room, someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the whole room, slowly, like a tide coming in. James did not smile. He did not raise his hand. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when something true has been said out loud, and sat back down. The legal proceedings that followed took 14 months. Carson Webb was indicted on 2 counts of real estate fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. His attorney argued mistake and misunderstanding. The jury took 3 hours to disagree. He was sentenced to 4 years. Meridian Land Services surrendered its state license and settled a civil suit for $2.3 million, a portion of which went into a fund Patricia Okafor helped establish for the legal defense of black landowners facing boundary disputes and adverse possession threats in rural Georgia. Margaret Holloway, who had been a victim in her own right, having purchased the estate in good faith from a fraudulent sale, reached a private settlement with James. She did not lose her home. James had never wanted her home. What he wanted, and what he received, was a formal correction of the county records, a public acknowledgement of the historical boundary, and a conservation easement on the disputed 37 acres that would prevent development on that land in perpetuity. She also, according to people close to both parties, sent James a handwritten letter. Nobody knows exactly what it said. James has never shown it to anyone. But Renee, who was sitting at the kitchen table when he read it, said he folded it carefully afterward and put it in the cedar box where he kept the original deeds. She said he didn't look angry. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired, she said. The way a person looks when something that should have been simple has finally, after a very long time, been made right. On the morning after the legal proceedings formally concluded, James Caldwell drove his truck to the field where it had all started. He parked in the same spot. Got out the same way, slowly, the way 67-year-old bones require. Pulled on his work gloves. The field was just the same. Red Georgia clay. Grass moving in the October wind. The oak line to the north, the creek glinting silver to the south. He walked to the center of the field and stood there the way he always did before beginning work, still, taking in the particular quality of the morning, reading the land the way his grandfather had taught him. Elias Caldwell had told him once, when James was very young, that the land doesn't care who thinks they own it. The land only cares who tends it. Who learns it. Who puts their hands in it year after year and asks what it needs. Everything else, Elias had said, is just paperwork. James smiled at that, at the memory, at the oak trees, at the red earth under his boots that had been Caldwell land since before James was born and would be Caldwell land long after he was gone. He crouched down, opened a paper bag, and pressed his soil tool into the earth. He had work to do. The land was waiting.